recently finished watching the documentary on Martin Scorsese on Apple TV, which I very much enjoyed. Goodfellas is one of my favorites. And the one line that really stuck out to me from this documentary is someone who said, he doesn't tell you what to think. And if you've ever seen Scorsese movies, they tend to have characters that you are following around. You start to have some kind of, connection or sympathy with, but they're also often not the greatest people. And you might be left with a certain sense of, what do I think about those people that I just spent the last couple hours with? And I think the obvious answer for most people who are experiencing storytelling or creating stories is that no, it's ideal when they don't tell you what to think, when you can form your own opinions and interpretation of what you've been reading or watching. But of course, in the real world, the answer isn't always so simple. Especially right now. You may have seen or read about the recent Netflix decision to try to capture more of casual viewers, with the idea that there's the statistic that 94% of people are tinkering on their phone while they watch television. Therefore, what they want is good background. Something that they can follow when they're only halfway paying attention, where a visual may be reinforced by the character repeating what was just seen and the character repeating plot details so that you don't have to keep up with them too much, oversimplified dialogue, and so on. Now, obviously, if somebody's reading a book, they're not going to be tinkering on their phone at the exact same moment they're reading, because that would be impossible, unless it's an audiobook, which are growing in popularity, so that's also very possible. But we do know that readers are now more likely to be distracted, whether because they're skimming your book, jumping between a social media app on one hand and then back to your book, and then answering a text and then back to your book. And if you have been writing or reading for a long time, you probably started to notice this creeping in, that popular books tend to be kind of simple, more so than they were in like the 80s or the 30s or previous decades or centuries. And if you've been writing, you may notice that you're getting readers who don't seem like they're really paying that much attention to your book, or they're just reading so voraciously that you're like, they didn't even really think about my book, like that they're just plowing through like a book a day. And it's not everybody, of course. I mean, that 94% of people being on their phone while watching TV, like that's not all the time, right? Right? You guys aren't all on your phone the entire time you're watching TV, right? But I also kind of get it. Like if I'm watching a show with a story, I am watching it. I am not on my phone. I hate trying to focus on two different things at once. But I do often have like a YouTube video on in the background while I'm like cooking, cleaning the kitchen, washing dishes, stuff like that I might only be half paying attention to. So I get it. And we can imagine how this will affect reading habits. If your attention span is very short, or you're not really fully paying attention to anything like ever, what are you going to want in a book? Simplicity, repetition, predictability. You're not going to notice inconsistencies with the plot or the world building unless they're really glaring. Like you just want vibes. So the world building doesn't really matter that much in a fantasy novel, for example, because you're not really paying that much attention to it anyway. And you will want those kind of things that really grab you without having to put a lot of thought into it. So like relatively simple language, good dialogue, a lot of feelings, drama, maybe like shock value, kind of like plot twists or action, just simple stuff. And perhaps most upsetting to me as a writer is that you might not really be following like character development or how a theme is dealt with to the same degree as someone who's paying close attention to a book. And that's what I really want to talk about here. And sometimes I am personally even guilty of putting YouTube on my television, putting on a video I really want to watch, and then getting distracted and scrolling on my phone while I have the video playing. I hate that I do that. I really, really value my ability to think deeply. I don't want to lose that. I have barely any apps on my phone, but the ones I do have, I try to just keep the ones that encourage some kind of valuable interaction or deeper thought or knowledge of some kind, such as Brilliant. Brilliant is the sponsor for today's video, and they can help anyone to excel in new skills, specifically in math and science. For the longest time, I thought that I was bad at math, but in recent years, I've realized that I really just learned it in a way that didn't seem to have any connection to real life and didn't really make sense. With visual interactive lessons and personalized practice, I found Brilliant to be a much more intuitive and relevant way to learn math than when I was in school. You learn through active problem solving. You're not just sitting there listening to a lecture or working your way through rote problems until you can remember just enough to pass a test. Brilliant builds genuine understanding to reach serious learning goals. And Brilliant personalizes learning for you by starting you at the right level based on your background and designing practice sets and reviews personalized for you. And it's crafted by an award-winning team of teachers, researchers, and professionals from MIT, Stanford, Harvard, Caltech, Google, and more. If you're someone like me who gets really excited about the prospect of just like learning a bunch of new different stuff, it's really fun just to even begin to choose what you're going to learn next. And they've been adding a lot of new content this year as well. To learn for free on Brilliant for a full 30 days, go to brilliant.org/thecozycreative, scan the QR code on screen, or click the link in the description. Brilliant's also given our viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited access to everything on Brilliant. Thank you, Brilliant. So this question pops up now and then in the community, like, how much do I explain or handhold my audience when I'm writing? Do I need to dumb anything down, particularly in light of knowing that people's attention spans are getting shorter? And what I have particularly noticed diminishing in recent years is people's ability to analyze a text or like be patient with it or let it challenge them and like just sit with the discomfort of different points of view. Or shoveled editing Lydia here. I forgot to mention, one of the things people seem to have the least patience with is the growth of a character who starts out flawed to a point where they might not be that likable and then becomes sympathetic and likable over the course of a book. Oh man, my friends and I are always talking about the lack of tolerance for a character to start off really flawed and become a better person over the course of the book. And this is not all readers, mind you. I see you English literature class genius waving your hand. Yes, a lot of you read very critically, and your opinions, however strong they may be, are based in deep thought, and that's great. And of course we know that this isn't new because, you know, I can see it in the Scorsese documentary, like when he was putting out movies that got people up in arms. It wasn't because of social media. That was before that happened. He was just creating stuff that a lot of people got offended by, and then a lot of people loved, because you would have to think about, like, what exactly is this movie trying to say? And in that case, different people are going to come to different conclusions about what the movie was trying to say and what they felt about it, and all of those feelings are valid. And as part of what makes art so great is because we all engage with it in different ways and we all have different takeaways. And just in a broad sense, that's all wonderful. It's the purpose of art. On the flip side of this, I've seen often that a criticism of romantasy books, especially, which are the hot thing to criticize, is that they have very simplified themes, like, you know, racism is bad, or bad kings are bad, or you know, something that pretty much the whole audience is going to agree is bad already is obviously bad.
Scrolling threads yesterday, and I see this Q&A with the author pop up, and the first question is, what inspired you to write Silver Elite? Your dystopian novel. What inspired you to write it? To which she answers, I was craving a dystopian fix. I'm a huge fan of dystopian stories, especially ones with kick-ass female leads. I'm sorry, is it 2008? Have I been transported back in time? Is there a Joss Whedon movie about to come out? But I find a lot of these types of books are for young adult readers, and I've always wanted to find a series that's on the spicier side. When I realized there weren't a ton out there, I decided to create my own spicy dystopia. If you are asked what inspired you to write a dystopian novel, and the answer is, I just wanted what I read as a teenager, but with sex, and not literally anything engaging with the concept of dystopia, that is not a good dystopia.
And there's some books that just kind of take a non-challenging opinion, at least one that your audience isn't probably going to be challenged by. Like, it's going to depend to some extent, but most of us kind of know what demographic our audience is and what they're going to agree is good or bad. And then we just kind of like affirm their viewpoint. Like in fantasy, I'm a fantasy writer. And of course, so much of fantasy, like what we think of as like classic fantasy, came from Tolkien, who lived through World War I and brought a lot of experiences and feelings from the war into Lord of the Rings. So I feel like a lot of fantasy books deal with a moral compass that is centered on World War I and or World War II. Those were such big events, and a lot of kind of groundwork fantasy pulled from those. And it would have been a very authentic and very heartfelt thing to write about for Tolkien, who lived it, right? But now we're kind of often still pulling from what Tolkien lived through instead of what we lived through, is how I sometimes feel. Now, for me personally, like, it depends so much on genre, and I really want my books to feel comforting, like a place that you want to be. But I also have never quite been able to shy away from the imperfections and the awkwardness and the morally gray aspects of society. It's one of the things that to me makes writing so interesting and compelling, is that you can explore many different viewpoints that challenge each other through different characters, and you're finding a way to make both of those viewpoints. It's like having a little debate club, but in a fictional work that you're having two characters, and when you're in their different points of view, they totally believe what they believe. So as the writer, you want to try to make the reader slightly conflicted. They like both of them, even though they might lean technically more to agreeing with one character. You want them to feel a little bit like, but I do like this antagonist or whatever. Even my good guys, I want them to have some real flaws, and I tend to show them in ways that sometimes make the character look genuinely a little bad or a little shady or a little inconsiderate or whatever. Like real people, sometimes the people you love in real life do something truly aggravating, and I cannot seem to help but want my characters to sometimes, no matter how much I love them and I want you to love them, but sometimes I also want to show like sometimes they are not great people, just like real people. So like Alfred in The Potion Dealers, he's a good guy, I would say. He's very loyal to his friends. He's generally pretty kind, pretty honorable, pretty good sense of justice. He's funny. He's the underdog that you want to root for, but he's also the heir to a mob family, and he is rich. And there are moments where I want you to really notice that he is, and that sometimes he is an entitled, tiny bit of an asshole. Just a tiny bit, because we love him, but even so, he can be very proud, self-serving, very deliberately manipulative, and sometimes violent. And when I write this darker side of his character, as well as the good side of his character, ideally, although I don't know if I achieve it or not, but I would ideally want it to feel the way the Scorsese movies did to the person who said he doesn't tell you what to think. Ideally, I would like you to make up your own mind about the characters, to find them interesting, hopefully, either way, but also to be like, I have to decide whether I think that he really is a good guy, entirely justified in his aims, or if in fact he's a little bit of a rogue that you probably shouldn't even have this level of power. But with that in mind, I have gotten some bad reviews that I think I just sense, and I don't know because I don't know the individual readers, and I don't want to invalidate anyone's individual opinion. But just, there's a pattern of my books. The types of reviews I get, sometimes I think come from people not liking that moral grayness, and not liking that sometimes I present bad things in a way that's not like, this is bad. That I just let the characters do things realistically, and sometimes they're complicated, and sometimes they don't like loudly disapprove of bad things the way that they maybe should. Which can then lead me, I'm not immune to this by any means. I once got a review that said something along the lines of, like, she's as subtle as beating someone with a rock. And I remember that review because I really hated that one. I really don't want to be that kind of writer. But I felt a little called out because I thought in the case of what they were talking about, they might have been a little bit right, that I was not being very subtle, because I felt like I needed to make sure that people knew bad thing is bad. I know bad thing is bad. Characters know bad thing is bad unless they are bad. Bad thing is bad. Some readers really tend to think that what the characters are thinking is what the author is thinking. And so then, as an author, if you know that there are some readers out there that will assume that, then suddenly you become very scared to have your characters think anything that you don't agree with, especially if it is in any way cruel or offensive, because you're like, uh-oh, some readers are going to think that I actually endorse this. And you can also pair that with the fear that you might unconsciously end up endorsing something that you don't even agree with, which is kind of how some of the discussions in young adult literature went down, particularly in kind of the peak cancel culture era. There were certain books that were being discussed, and to me it was getting very muddy as to like what is moral in a book. Like, what have we decided is like acceptable when it comes to writing challenging material, and how far we're presenting this material as like good or bad. Most people agreed that we did not want to be consciously or unconsciously promoting harm to people, but at the same time that we as writers were becoming kind of scared to like write anything that dealt with anything at all. Pretty much everybody I talked to was feeling that level of like, when am I writing something challenging and doing good for the world versus harming it? I think one thing that is not discussed very often when it comes to the rise of the smutty romance novel is that I think it kind of rose out of that atmosphere, that a lot of the readers were the young adult novel readers, like younger women. And by younger women, of course, I mean younger but adult women. If you're not in the loop with young adult, as young adult fiction was booming, the majority of readers were not young adults anymore. They were adult women. So I think a lot of those are the readers that became the romance readers. Of course, also, teenage girls grow up to be young adult women in no time. So there's also that, because, we're talking about a span of 20 years here. I do wonder sometimes if part of the reason that the smutty romance became so popular is because suddenly, like, there were no rules. There was no shaming. If there was any attempt to shame anybody for almost anything, it would fall under the category of no kink shaming. So then romance became kind of a safe space to explore taboos, darker subjects, problematic material, and kind of shield it all under the idea that this is all just like we're exploring our sexuality, and we know it's not real. Now it's in the mainstream, so it's under scrutiny again. But the readers did kind of figure out ways to shield themselves against any kind of criticism of their material. And they showed up to the party already armed, which young adult did not. And they are somewhat different things, because a lot of the discussion in young adult was more about representation of like underrepresented groups. Whereas in romance, it's more about exploring taboo topics and uncomfortable gender dynamics. But it is interesting to me how all of this unfolded like right on top of each other. I do think there's a correlation. And, I do want to clarify a little more that these are somewhat different conversations, and that probably the primary conversation in young adult was people writing outside their lane about like cultures, races, disabilities, etc., that they did not know much about, and not doing any research or talking to people from those cultures or talking to people with those experiences. So I'm not trying to say like, hey, white ladies, wasn't it so much better when we could just write about whatever the heck and nobody criticized us for it? If you know me at all, you know that I certainly try to take it very seriously when I write about someone who has a different cultural experience than I do. I've talked in other videos about writing. One of my favorite of my characters, Alfred, who is blind, and I've done so much research on it, and in the course of all this research, really realized the depth of so many harmful stereotypes perpetuated in media about blind people that you don't really meet that many blind people in real life. So those stereotypes become the main way people know about the experience of a blind person. And that really affects people's lives. And that bleeds over into general disability representation. My partner is disabled, and he's not affected to the degree that a blind person would be by cultural representation, but like we have encountered people saying stupid things or assuming things that aren't true. I think that's a fairly universal experience for a lot of people with disabilities. So I try to carry that attitude into everything I write where I'm writing about someone who isn't me, where it might actually affect how people perceive real people. So that conversation is very important to me, and I don't think that we should just drop it. But it wasn't just that. It started to bleed over in all kinds of things in young adult. There was obviously like writing queer characters when you were not out of the closet. There were some writers that got outed or basically felt like they had to come out just because they had written a queer book that turned out to be kind of the way they were exploring their sexuality or gender identity and like finding their way toward being honest with themselves. Like the book was part of the process, but then they were getting criticized for writing a queer book when they weren't queer. There were also some really big blow-ups about just like the interactions between authors and bloggers and readers. There were those same conversations about misogyny and toxic relationships that we're still having in romance. So there was all kinds of stuff. The thing that made it confusing and scary to me was that sometimes it would be extremely clear to me why people were upset. Other times I was not quite sure what the problem was, and due to we all really, I think, are aware of like clickbait and rage bait now, that things can blow up just because they get clicks and they get people upset. I think we were still kind of learning that back then. So when something would blow up, I would really struggle. Like, am I out of touch? Am I getting old and, not down with what the kids are concerned about? Or is this blowing up mainly because it's just drama for clicks? It's not always clear. I would love to say that it is, but for me, it is not always clear. So that makes just communication terrifying sometimes, simply because, I'm just not always sure if I'm turning into the old lady who's like, you can't have a robot boyfriend, or if this is just the internet being the internet. Now I want to talk about fantasy specifically for a minute here. For those of us who grew up admiring any really well-developed fantasy world like Middle-earth or Westeros or Discworld or like me, the ElfQuest comics, there's lots of different kinds of fantasy world building, but what so much of it has in common is that it kind of gets better the more you pay attention to it and the more you experience it. And if people are kind of just barely paying attention to what they're reading, I worry, is that going to be like the death of great world building? A lot of fantasy books nowadays are often trending a little more to being written in the first person with a lot of very immediate feelings over like more of a sweeping epic scope, especially with the rise of romantasy, but also even genres like cozy fantasy, which I very much love. But I still do want a sense of the scope and richness of a fantasy world in a fantasy. Like, that is one of the things that I love about fantasy, is its ability to draw me into this vast new place. And this is where I would love to tell you, my fellow writers out there, to hold your ground, stand firm, do not dumb it down, let your Tolkien inclinations run wild. But in truth, if you are trying to actually sell your book, sometimes you might find yourself trying to walk a very careful tightrope, especially if you do start to get bad reviews from people who like just entirely missed what you were trying to do, whether it's the themes, something uncomfortable that's a part of your world that you wanted to explore and challenge. or just like the level of detail that you wanted to get into in a world where people aren't paying attention. Sometimes as authors, we might just want to like find the people who review our books and be like, no, that's not what I was saying. And in fact, there have been a few authors who actually have done that with your reviews, which I do not advise, but no author can force an interpretation on a reader, which is generally a good thing. Nevertheless, sometimes I do feel like I am being punished for my writing style because of the aforementioned way that I sometimes like to push buttons a little bit and make like my romantic lead not 100% likable in like a real way. Like my male and female leads, I like to think about their real imperfections, and sometimes I like to really kind of let them bleed onto the page a little bit, and not in like a sexy way. Like, oh, he's such a bad boy. He's dangerous. He's edgy. You know, I don't even write those kind of guys. I mean, in a legitimate, like, this couple, they love each other so much, and at some point they could have just the ugliest, stupidest argument that you can imagine. I love writing Alfred and Livonia's relationship. I think they really fulfill things that the other person needs. They have really good chemistry, and they really try to be there for each other, and they're like the best of friends. But at the same time, I can absolutely imagine them having a fight where they're just sarcastic and manipulative and just nasty to each other, like a real fight. Probably not too often. Probably the makeup session will be great, but nevertheless, like, I can totally see them having this kind of like ugly fight, and I haven't written it, and I don't know if I ever will write that, but just the fact that I can imagine it, I think bleeds onto the pages of all the books I write a little bit, that sometimes things can get a little too real. And I think a lot of the clash is that if you have certain types of readers that just want to escape, and they don't want to be upset by certain things, and everybody has different things that upset them and trigger them, and you as the writer don't necessarily know what they will be. But the more you veer away from formulaic, safe, and bland, the more likely you are to simply push someone's buttons, whether you know it or not, because that's just how art is. Sometimes it is messy, and you might sometimes get some bad reviews because someone wanted escapism and you didn't quite deliver it to them in the way they wanted, or someone wanted simple and you threw complicated at them, or somebody wanted a self-insert heroine who's kind of a blank, and instead you gave them like a complicated, vaguely bitchy character that grows and changes over the course of the book, and your reader's like, I didn't want that. You don't know this reader. You don't know everything they have brought to the table when they read your book. But by the same token, you might also have the reader who so deeply appreciates the fact that you delved into something that is a little different, maybe a little uncomfortable. One of my favorite young adult novels is this, A True and Faithful Narrative by Catherine Sturdivant. And one of the reasons that I love this very underappreciated gem of a book so much is that it is not afraid to be uncomfortable. But it's also quite romantic. I think it's more romantic for the fact that it is not afraid to be uncomfortable. And this is a theme throughout the whole book. Even before we meet the romantic lead of the book, it takes place in the 17th century, and we have Meg, who is the child of a bookseller, and her father parents her realistically for the 17th century generally. Like, I think at one point she's beaten. She is expected to have a woman's place. And she is a little rebellious, but not rebellious in the way that some heroines are, like not unrealistically rebellious. And her best friend's brother sets sail for Italy, and the ship is captured by pirates, and he is sold into slavery in North Africa, and a ransom price is set for him. And it takes a while to raise the ransom, and she agrees to write a narrative. I think that something about the narrative was supposed to help pay for his ransom, but I haven't read it in a while, so I'm not sure. But she agrees to write like a thrilling narrative of his adventure and his time in captivity and how he was this, great virtuous Christian who told the infidels, blah, blah, blah. Like that would have been the thing at the time. There were like real books like that. So once he's come back, she talks to him to get his story. And the real story is very complicated and uncomfortable in multiple ways. Like he admits to being a coward. He admits to his complicated feelings about being captured. He admits that he didn't school anybody on Christianity while he was there. In fact, one gets the sense that his very view of the world has been greatly shaken and that he doesn't necessarily even believe in or fit in the same way that he did before all of this happened. And even when they're finally reaching their happily ever after, he still says, "We cannot see our futures. It might be if we were to marry that you would die within a year in childbed, or I would be taken off by a chill after 5 and leave you alone with little ones to rear, or it might fall out differently." He took his seat again opposite me and regarded me intently. Perhaps we would put Henry to mind the warehouse and sail to the Mediterranean to trade in sherry and Madeira. We might live in Livorno and teach our children to speak Italian and visit Cairo at Ramadan, or perhaps I would take you to see the white roofs of Algiers. He paused, but I could not speak. It was clear that Edward had thought many times of such a future, but to me it was new, and my breath caught as the vision unfolded before me. It is only fair to imagine the good as well as the bad, after all, though I allow it is less likely to happen. More often those we love die in our arms, and our fortunes founder, and our dearest projects are left incomplete because our powers fail us. Yes, these things are very common, are they not? It is just for this reason that it is hard to go through life alone. But if you have courage enough, why then, I admire you, Meg. It's kind of his proposal, and it's definitely not the most romantic, but to me it was more romantic because it reflected that he has been through it. His sense of self and of the very nature of his life has been shaken in a realistic way, and he is acknowledging all the perils of life, and yet through all of that they have found a real connection. But I can also see why this book did not take off like Twilight, came out around the same time. So as with all things, you have to find your own balance between how commercial you want to be and how much you want to really make an effort to connect with a broad audience versus how much you want to allow yourself to make things that are a little uncomfortable or a little strange or a little confusing. But I hope that we artists will always keep trying to push things just a little. And please tell me your favorite books that left you unsure how to think. Once again, I would like to thank Brilliant for sponsoring this video, and make sure to check them out. If you'd like more from me, I have a membership tier where you can get access to 2 free bonus videos per month voted on by you guys. I have quite a lot of them at this point, and access to my Discord server where we talk about writing and creative stuff and nerdy stuff all day. If you would like to read any of my books, there is a link in the description. The Hidden Lands are the books of my heart and the ones that were discussed in this video. But I also have quite a variety, including some that probably do have all the subtlety of beating you over the head with a rock or whatever. I post every Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern. And as always, thank you so much for watching and supporting me. Bye!